Hi guys, Miss Moon here from Operation Awesome. Today we're doing another tutorial, this time an applique tutorial. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term, applique is a technique of sewing cut out pieces of fabric onto large pieces of fabric to make patterns and shapes. It's especially useful if the pattern or shape is not one that you can easily fold over to make a seam allowance, because it's a method of covering rough edges of a piece of fabric when you sew it on. As you can imagine, it's got a lot of applications for cosplay, because so many times you just need a patch, or you just need a bit of detailing on an outfit, especially if you like to buy pre-existing things and edit them. Viola Power, Maria, who you may remember from the Digicon and from York Christmas meet, asked me if I could do a tutorial on my method, which I did briefly show when making the Totoro work log, because I don't use fusible webbing, and for Totoro I didn't even use an iron, but that was because it was fleece. I don't like to use fusible webbing, mainly because it leaves a mess on your ironing board, it leaves a mess on your iron, it pulls away and is tricky to get into tiny little bits, and it leaves a crunchy texture similar to interfacing. That texture does tend to go when you wash it, but because my cosplays are delicate, I don't like to wash them fully. If I can help it, I just tend to spot dab and be very careful when I wear them. For it, you will need the base piece. For this, I'm using Baymax's coat as an example, because we have the applique here on the sleeves. So the base was the sleeve piece for this before I sewed it, because obviously since this is gathered, I didn't want to sew on the gather. So I've sewn it on the flat before the gather. You'll need the base piece, you'll need your fabric that you're using cut out, you will need thread in the colour that you're appliquing in, you'll need a seam ripper, because I always do, because I suck, thread snips, and a sewing machine. It might be possible to do this by hand, but if so, I don't know how it's done. When it comes to sewing machine, you do need one that has a straight stitch, which all sewing machines have, and you also need a satin stitch, which not all sewing machines have. If you have a zigzag stitch, you may be able to make it work by fiddling with the tension, but I'd recommend, if you're going to do that, testing it on some scrap fabric before you do it on your actual cosplay. So yeah, here's my method for appliquing without using that fusible web. Before I start, I've cut 2 pieces of purple to the size that I need for my applique with no seam allowance. I'm now taking the piece that I'm appliquing it onto. I'm appliquing onto this sleeve piece before I do anything further to it. If you've got your garment readily constructed, so long as you can iron it flat like I'm currently doing, then it will still work. But since I'm planning on gathering this sleeve, I'm doing the appliquing now. Once I've got the piece ironed flat, I'm going to take my applique piece and place it where I want it before ironing that onto. If we were using Wonder Web, we would be using some Wonder Web between these two, but instead I'm going to be using this pin method. Taking some glass-headed pins, I'm going to pin the applique to the fabric. It's very important that you use glass-headed pins, because we're going to be applying heat to this, and plastic pins will melt and ruin your iron. Now, since the glass-headed pins have wrinkled up the fabric, we're going to do another iron to make sure it's completely flat and how we want it before we take it to do the sewing section of this. Set your sewing machine to its widest straight stitch, and then we're just going to do a straight stitch around the edge of the applique as close to the edge as we can manage. Don't worry if it does go towards the centre of the fabric, you're essentially wanting to tack the two together. Once you've sewn it all the way around, you should have the applique piece securely on and flat. But we still have this rough edge which we need to cover. For this, we're going to turn our sewing machine onto a satin stitch. I have 3 different lengths of satin stitch. I'm going to use the furthest to the left since this is a fairly thin fabric, but if you're using a thicker fabric then I would use a wider satin stitch. Once you've done a satin stitch for a little way, instead of going back on itself like you would do normally with a straight stitch, we're instead going to pull the loose thread through to the back of the fabric and tie them together. This will give us a neater appearance. Then just continue with a straight stitch all the way around, trying to cover the straight stitches that you've done as well as the edge, but focus on covering the edge more than covering the stitches. We're then going to once again pull the loose thread through to the back of the fabric and tie the 2 ends off together. You can see that I haven't managed to completely cover my straight stitches here, so we're going to solve that now. With a seam ripper, go around the outside and get rid of any remaining straight stitches. Be careful not to remove any of the satin stitching that you've done, and then pull any loose threads out through the back of the fabric. And there you have it. That is my version of appliquing with no fusible web. As I said before, unfortunately it's not a non-iron method because with cotton and canvas it creases, unlike fleece that would lie flat whenever I put it. If you're wanting to use this method to do an applique that has multiple layers, like say for example on BB-8 we have some sections where we have the orange circle and then we have the grey on top of the orange, I'd recommend sewing the bottom layer on first and fully appliquing that, and then appliquing on whatever your top layer is on, and so on and so forth. Again, those of you who saw the Totoro video will be going, wait a minute, you didn't do that for the Totoro video, what are you hypocrite? Yeah, but that's because Totoro is fleece, isn't it? And appliquing fleece is not fun for this little machine. It was struggling appliquing 2 layers of fleece, so I did not want to try and push it and try and make it applique 3. That's really the only reason. If there's anything else I've not fully explained in this tutorial, I've tried to be as comprehensive, but I will always miss stuff. So if there's anything you don't understand, please feel free to leave it in a comment and tell me what you thought. And while you're there, why don't you leave me a like, leave us a subscribe. We've got more video ideas on the way, so please look forward to those. For a quick update and advertising doodad, we have some panels! Officially, we've got panels this year. I will be running panels at YourCon in June. I'll be running my Beginner's Guide to Cosplay and Cosplay Disasters. And then in KitterCon in August, I will be running Cosplay Disasters again, and Louise will be running Props and Armour on a budget. Those 2 are the 2 that we have officially, and we've heard back from. I have applied for panels at Alcon in September and York Geek Fest in October. We will wait, and I'm like 90% confident that I will get one, but I haven't officially heard back yet. So we'll see. Yeah, so look out for us at all of those events, and please come and say hi if you're coming. I hope you enjoyed this video, and goodbye.
It was fun.